Now, in my previous video, I mentioned the possibility of Germanic peoples and Scandinavian peoples not practicing divination. I also brought up how I was not sure fully. What I do know is it was written by Acticus that they would use limbs off of trees and they would carve symbols into it and they would place it in like a white cloth. And there's also stories in the Eddas that have a similar practice but has to do with kind of like a wooden spoon. But kind of like our culture and kind of like Scandinavian and Germanic culture is that stuff written by the Roman and Greeks could also have been stuff that was made up later by Christians. It is hard to tell. Some things are 50-50. But it is very possible that they did. But I wasn't sure on that. But I'm focusing on the Celts and what the Celts practiced. There's some other cultures too that weren't known for doing divination, such as ancient Vedic cultures across Asia and India. The Mongolians had a game where they would use teeth and they would use it as like a game of dice. And on Wikipedia they say it's a form of divination, but really it's just a game. So when it came to the Mongolians and Asian cultures as such, they were more focused on stuff like animism and forms of shamanism, like practices, which I'm going to read about here. Now, let's say with the evidence of the Pulse Eddas and Tacitus about the Norse and the Germanic peoples practicing divination. If they did practice it, still to this day, scholars don't know if it was actual runes that were written or it was certain symbolism that was carved into the wood. Today, runes are used for divination, but they're used as symbolism. In actuality, those would have been used as writing tools, which you can find in Scandinavian countries today. So let's say they did practice it, it wouldn't have been done in the way it is today. It would have been writing systems, so how it's used nowadays would not be historically accurate, though it is very possible that they did practice divination. Now, I'm going to read a book by David Schiffner, Old Irish for Beginners. Now, the thing is about this book and the title, it's not just about Old Irish, it's also about writing systems, so we're going to get into it. In this book right here, on the first page, talks about the Irish language and how it is a Latinized language and a Greek-inspired language and a Sanskrit-inspired language. It has been speculated by other scholars that could have been a continental thing as well. This is a very good book too. It also brings up the other Celtic languages as well. It talks about Laponic, which is a dead Celtic language. It talks about Celtiberian. It talks about the Gaelic languages. It talks about Cumbric languages, Late Cornish, Middle Cornish, Manx Gaelic, Southwest British, Middle Britain, Old Britain. Then talks about other Proto-Indo-European languages. Now, when I say Asia, I don't mean all of Asia. There are parts that did practice divination, such as China. China, they invented esography when they started drinking tea. And that wasn't brought into Western Europe until later periods. So there's parts of Asia that did practice a form of divination, and then there's cultures in Asia that didn't. Same with Africa, there would have been some tribes that would have practiced divination, and then there would have been tribes that didn't. It all varies on regions. There would have been some Europeans that did and Europeans that didn't. So for somebody to claim, I saw it in my last video, that everybody practiced divination, that is false. Not everybody practiced divination. I'm also going to go over what the definition of divination is. And the reason why I'm bringing this up here is because I feel like these stuff are very important when talking about this type of topic. Not just whether or not if we practice divination, the Celts practice divination, but it explains the regions of the writing systems as well, which we're going to get into later on in this book. So when talking about different cultures and ancient peoples practicing divination, there's another misconception that runes were just Scandinavian or runes was just Germanic. We can also see similar inscriptions found in Iberia and Portugal, but here are some inscriptions where you could obviously see the similarities between the runic alphabet that is very highly associated with Norse culture and Germanic culture. You could see various different types of inscriptions of the same symbolism that is found in runes. And I'm also going to go over what it is believed that this translates to. And also, there's another misconception about how the ancient Celts did not write anything down. The thing is, if they didn't write anything down, then we wouldn't have these inscriptions now, would we? Now, I don't know that when scholars use that type of wording, if they're just referring to the Celts of the British Isles, or the late Bronze Age to Iron Age Celts as a whole. But obviously they did write stuff down, and it's because of these inscriptions, it makes me believe that there's only more to be found, that archaeology did not find yet. There very well could be more, there could be some that is lost to time, but in this book it also talks about some regions and areas that are sacred to the Celts, that have to do with the gods that they worshipped. And this Lugano alphabet system is found in Switzerland, from a Latin Gaulish bilingual inscription from the Versailles, reprinted by permission. Alright, it just says they got permission. So here it says that it has silver measure gave this area for the gods and humans. So it had to do with a river that had to be associated with certain gods in that time period. Now when talking about certain regions and rivers and waterways, that has to do with mythology as well as sacred places. So here we have an inscription found in Switzerland that proves that the Celts did write a little bit of what their beliefs were and their mythology surrounding the gods. Well, we have writings from later periods in the British Isles, which we can compare the two. But the point is that they did write stuff down. So I also brought up in my last video that Ogham was not used for divination, which I'll also bring up in this book too when it talks about the history of Ogham. And also, I noticed a similarity of nowadays where you see Ogham being carved into wood or branches and used for divination. That is very similar to what I brought up earlier in this video that was written by Tacitus, about the Germanic groups had a similar practice. I'm assuming they based it off of that because there were groups that were Celtic and German. They had fair trades together. They shared and occupied the same regions as each other, such as Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and France. there would have been tribes that were Celtic, there would have been tribes that were Germanic, who fought in wars against each other. So, the idea of trade, that is one possibility that could make it possible that the Celts did practice divination, but there isn't a lot of evidence that holds up to that. That they would have borrowed that from the Germanic tribes. And actually, this inscription right here is a good example of why the Celts wrote down their of the Celts writing down their mythos. It says, "I pray with the written force of interior and the sky gods of the sun Maponos." So right here, we're already talking about how Maponos is the son of a sky god, which is why other scholars in the UK region ties Maponos to Ingazolg. And actually, this is one of the books that had me tie them into the story of Atlantis in Iberia and Portugal with Noburu. And Noburu is also a god of youth and winds, which, if you read James McCabe Oxford Journal about the Celts and the Celtic Dictionary, he also talks about how there are stories in Ireland, oral traditions, of Angazolg, Ognazolg, and Medier as the same deity. There's also stories of where he's an adoptive father figure, I believe. Yeah, he's an adoptive father figure. His real father is the Dodka in Irish mythology. But it also says up above, too, attempt at translation, very doubtful. So, I don't know where that source is from, but if it is accurate, then that would be an idea of Celts writing down their mythos. It also brings up of Arenia, which she would be like Argentina. She's basically like the continental version of the Morrigan. So here we have a story of a wind god of youth being related to a goddess of the underworld, if true. Actually, this is the same story found in Cantabrian mythology and Ostros mythology, which kind of makes me think that this is supported, actually. I know in Irish mythology, the mom of Ognazolg and Ingersoll in mid-year is different and is not based on the continental story. But basically what David is saying, he's agreeing and not agreeing to it. So it's agreement to disagree type thing, he's not really sure. Now, I study multiple different spectrums of Celtic mythology and I study my bad there. I study ancient beliefs that are older than European beliefs and found a similar pattern here. This pattern is also found in Vedic beliefs. So if this inscription is not very doubtful, as what Shifter says very doubtful as, then chances are that this could be an actual myth that was written. It also talks about, where was I? Urania, us and them with the magic of the underworld. Now, today in mythology, we look at the underworld as the otherworld, but the underworld would be a term that would be used by the Romans and Greeks in their writings. And you see some various names at the bottom. And it also states, or woman of Arena, or woman of the underworld. And because the same mythos is also found in the Vedic text, I would want to say that maybe part of this is factual. Scrolling down to the bottom, there's some names that I'm not familiar with, or their relation. But one of them looks very similar to Eidos. It is Adelios, and they who swear this oath. And this is another very important part of the book, right before heading into and Ogham when it comes to writing systems, is that until the conquest by Julius Caesar in the years 58-51 BC, The Greek alphabet was used for all writing purposes in Gaul, with some slight modifications, e.g. in Tau and Gallium. It was on its way to develop into a national alphabet after the incorporation of Gaul into the Roman Empire. The Greek alphabet slowly went out of use for Gaulish and was ultimately replaced by the Roman alphabet. Latin was spoken in Asia Minor, today central Turkey. Because of its geographical remoteness, it is often taken as a language of its own, though from all that we know, it must have been a dialect of Gaulish brought to Asia Minor by Celtic invaders. Now, this would have to do with older information, mostly by T. Knox, when he talked about how the views of the Celts and the Celtic people started in Western Europe, but it was proven later that it was actually east to west. Latin does share similarities to Gaulish, and in the 3rd century BC. So there's the Greek alphabet table, there's the Roman alphabet table. There was also Iberian script from different time periods that the continental Celts would have used in order to write down either the names of their deities or the things they may have been associated with, things like that. Then I think that has to do with Claudius, Marcus, Victorius. I'm not sure about the relationship between the names written by him, but it says son of. So I'm guessing that would be his parents. And he was a writer and a poet. It basically just says that Ogham or Ohm, depending on if it's Old Irish or Irish, most probably developed in Ireland itself or in the multicultural environment of southwest Britain during the later centuries of Roman rule. That is another concept of when various groups of Celts have traveled into the British Isles was during the Roman rule of Gaul and the Roman rule of Iberia. It's also possible on archaeological record that even earlier to the 1st century BC as well. Shifter also brings up being associated with a variety of trees, which I feel like gave the misconception that the Celts used it as a form of divination like the Germanic peoples did because of its association with trees, and it shows how Ohm changed over time and how it fits with the Irish alphabet involving trees such as fern, oak, holly, hazel. And Shifter got this from scholar Damien McManus, who has written various literature and books on Ogham from Ireland, and he's a professor. Now, when talking about the different practices of divination, I talk about tessography, which is a form of divination that was found in China. Now we're going to go over what it actually means for those who don't know what divination means and how it's at times used incorrectly. Divination means you're using certain artifacts or you're reading something in order to tell the future or seek what's about to come from spirits or deities. That could be used with all sorts of materials, really. Coffee grounds, tea leaves, any type of object, really. And if it lands a certain way, or even nowadays, it'd be cards, it'd be tarot cards. That's a form of divination. Invocation would be almost like a prayer where you're praying to something, asking for help. Astrology, some label it as being a form of divination, but it is not. Astrology would be like the study of space, the study of the celestial bodies. So that includes rotation, stars, moons, things of that nature. I think it has to do with the idea of seeing it, witnessing it, and counting. I think it's the counting aspect of why some people might put it in the same section as practicing divination, but it is not. Animism has to do with seeing life as a whole as an energy, meaning everything has a value to life, which you can see something similar to Siberian culture with shamanism, and that itself is its own thing. And then in the future, I'm going to read sources by Julius Caesar, Strabo, and Tacitus as well. We're going to go over the Greek and Roman writings of the ancient past. This book also talks about such writing. This is The Sacred Isle and Belief in Religion in Pre-Christian Ireland by Data O'Haga. And he talks about what the Druids practiced in ancient Ireland. One thing I found interesting in this book is he compares the two of Irish mythology and continental Celtic mythology, and he also talks about the shared spectrums that they would have shared, which not a lot of scholars do, and a lot of people who try to teach such things even over in those countries or regions fail to actually bring up and talk about it in their studies, and actually want to separate everything into its own entity. Now I'm going to do my very best to pronounce certain words. Here we go. We're going to be talking about Druids and how the Druids of continental Europe would have been the later inspiration for the Druids in the British Isles. Let me see. Especially from Gaul, the only real indication that the institution may have been known further east is given by Greek writer Divination, who, drawing on a source from the 2nd century BC, states the Celts and the Galatins had seers called the Druidae and Seminoli. This might be taken to mean that the Celts of that eastern area in the Galatians in present-day Turkey had a type of Druids known as the Simnathoi, but the meaning of this later word is unclear. It may indeed not be Celtic or Indo-European or an Indo-European word at all, but rather borrowing of the word shaman itself, a Tungu word which is believed by scholars to derive from Turku, Mongolian languages spoken in Central Asia. The word may therefore have been heard by the Greek writers and wrongly associated with the Celts of the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, a later writer associates the learned case of Salmani with the Brectons. Duinis Lateros gives his reference to Druidae and Synthoia in a list of priestly caste of Eastern peoples, such as the Magi of the Persians and the Chaldeans of the Babylonians and the Eurasians and the Genosophis of Hindus, which Hindus would be the Indus people who practice ancient Vedic beliefs as well as other types of ancient Indus beliefs during that time, depending on what Indus text you're reading. Where am I? Okay. It would therefore appear that he had heard some institutionalized case of seers among the Galatins, whether or not They were actually known as Druids. Later Greek writers refer to the Galatans as having Druids, but these are all based either on Diogenes or his source. The argument for Druids in Galatia is weakened by the fact that Greek writers often refer to Gaul itself as Galatia, and on the other hand, Strabo describes the Galatian judicial council assembled at a place called Julmenten, Great Sanctuary, and since Nipton was the word commonly used by Western Celts for a sacred center, this might be taken to indicate that broadly similar types of institutions were found throughout the Celtic world. The likelihood is that already by formalized socio-religious system had begun to develop. Several places in the Western Celtic world were referred to by this word Nenapton, indicating that these were sacred centers. Instances of Nenaptodrome Nectaire in France, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, and in Spain, and talks about different regions, Scotland. So between the words Sebdoi and Neptune, they most likely came from each other. Neptune would have been a later word, which is found in Western Europe. And words like Neptune would be like the sacred places, kind of like temples and sacred grounds. And this right here is page 73. I'm going to go over what is some things that Julius Caesar has said that a lot of scholars don't believe is factual, but is something to take with skepticism. The whole concept of Gaulish people exceedingly sacrificing multiple people on a regular basis. He brings that up. He also brings how, in order to cure illness or sickness, that they would sacrifice a human life in order to appease the gods to save another life. Which I'm going to go from the bottom. He goes on to claim that the Gaulish tribe sacrificed large amounts of men by burning, and they considered that the gods preferred thieves and robbers to innocent people. For this purpose, Diodocus makes a direct connection between human sacrifice and divination and the practices of the Druids. According to him, they told the future by watching the flights of birds and by observation of entrails of victims when attempting divination upon important matters they hadn't old. So now over Julius Caesar, we ended up jumping into Diodocus and the counting of birds that is also found in ancient India and ancient Indus practices. Is that divination? To be honest, it's just counting, even though both cultures did share the counting of birds. There's no telling what that could actually mean or represent. And as for entrails, that's just something we can't prove because, organs fall on the ground and they just get eaten by omnivores. That, and based on the archaeological record, there has not been a body found that would indicate such a practice happened, at least not yet. Tradition of killing a man by stabbing him from the midriff and then foretelling the future by the convulsion of his limbs and the pouring of blood. The Celts had held that no sacrifice should be made to the gods without a druid, for they say that thanks should be offered to the gods by those skilled in the divine nature, as through they were people who could speak their language, and through them also they hold that benefits should be acts. Human sacrifice was banned by the Romans, who may add by their own practices showed that they did not themselves have much qualms about cruelty and inhumanity. Druids did not change the general tradition on this account, however, as it is clear the statement of Apollonius Mela that in the middle of the 1st century AD they were refraining from the outright slaughter, but nevertheless still drew blood from people as a substitute for sacrifice. Through although he also accused the Druids of performing heinous human sacrifice, Strongbow was willing to look onto them in a more positive light. So here we got something we can't prove from the earlier sources, and then we have sources that say, yeah, they did some type of sacrifice back in ancient times, but it wasn't how it was described by Caesar. And then others would say they refrained from it in later periods as a whole. And now back to the reading of birds with ornithancy. That was also something that the Greeks did as well, and not just the ancient Vedic people. Though it's labeled as a form of divination, it's more like animism. You're basically counting animals or counting birds in order to know if something good or bad is going to happen. I guess that's pretty much what it's supposed to be. Though it is similar to divination, it's not a physical object that is laid out and you're not asking for guidance. It's something that you see out in the wilderness in nature that you're trying to get a read on. Kind of like seeing a sacred animal as a sign or an omen. I think that would be the closest thing to interpret that would be animism, seeing an omen. Caesar also stresses the function of arbitration, and in so doing represents the Druid as a sacred person. He claims that when an individual or a tribe disobeyed the ruling of a Druid, the offenders were banned from attending at sacrifices. This says that Caesar was considered the harshest penalty for men. And Dato Hagon also mentions that there is no contemporaneous accounts of the Druids in Ireland, but several centuries later in Irish literature is expensive on the topic, although many of these Irish descriptions are fanciful. There is reason to believe that they contain some things that are genuine. Strands of tradition in them, the wise man, variously called Druphile or Feta, is claimed to have possessed an arcane and a magical kind of knowledge called Fis or Embos, from Envos, which means complete fist. The wise man himself is frequently referred to in Irish literature. Fissa, another derivative of the word, and his knowledge was portrayed as antiquarian, clairvoyant, and prophetic. It is these three levels of knowledge, indeed, that occurred wisdom specifically operates in Irish tradition, and the possession of such knowledge was considered by the writers to be sufficiently impressive. An emboss is a Irish tradition which was brought up in this book. It was brought up in later periods, which could have inspiration from earlier periods. In my last video, I talked about the Larzark tablet that was found in France and how that was invocation. That's pretty much what emboss is invocation, kind of like a chakra, where you say the same chant over and over. It's kind of like a way of giving a praise. So basically you just keep saying emboss, just repeatedly recycled. So that is invocation. He also goes on again about the stories of Cuchulainn and the Morgan and the reading of the birds, and how there is a bird known as the dream bird, who was a druid bird, who in old Irish text and stories was able to see the future, which could be based off of the idea of the ancient Greeks and Vedic peoples reading birds for signs as omens. But as you can see, there's not a lot of evidence for Celts practicing divination, but there was invocation, animism, and something kind of like shamanism.